Big Shaq had always been a man who stood out in any crowd. Whether he was walking into a grocery store, standing at a traffic light, or simply sitting in a quiet cafe, his size and presence made people turn their heads. On this particular afternoon, he was driving through a small town he had never visited before. He was traveling between events and decided to take a break from the highway. His body needed to stretch, and his stomach was rumbling for something more filling than the protein bars he had in his car. He noticed a simple roadside diner with a glowing neon sign that read "Best Burgers in Town." It looked old-fashioned, the kind of place where the food was hearty and the atmosphere friendly. Without much thought, he turned his large SUV into the small parking lot. As soon as he parked, the sound of motorcycles broke the calm. A group of bikers, about 6 of them, rode in and lined their bikes across the front of the diner. Their engines growled, echoing across the quiet street. People walking nearby stopped and stared. The bikers weren't necessarily causing trouble, but their presence always drew attention. They wore matching leather jackets, patches on the back that marked them as part of a local club. They laughed loudly, and the way they leaned on their bikes gave the impression that they owned the place. Shaq watched them for a moment, shaking his head slightly. He wasn't afraid. He had seen tougher groups before, but he could already tell that this might not be the calm meal he had imagined. Shaq stepped out of his SUV, towering over everyone else in the lot. At 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a chest that looked like it could fill a doorway, he immediately caught the eyes of the bikers. They stopped talking and turned toward him. For a few seconds, there was only silence, followed by smirks. One of them nudged another and whispered something, which made the group chuckle. Shaq had been around long enough to know the look. They were trying to size him up, treating him like a stranger they could test. He ignored them at first, shutting his car door gently and stretching his arms after the long drive. The crowd outside the diner, which had grown curious at the noise of the motorcycles, started whispering too. Some of them recognized the big man instantly, while others just stared at his size in disbelief. Shaq walked calmly toward the entrance of the diner. His long stride made it clear he wasn't in a hurry, but he also wasn't going to be stopped easily. The bikers, however, didn't move aside. They leaned against their motorcycles, blocking the door casually as if it was their personal hangout. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and sunglasses, crossed his arms and tilted his head. "Well, look at this big guy," he said in a loud voice that was meant for everyone around to hear. The rest of the group laughed. Another added, "Where you headed, giant? You sure that diner's got food big enough for someone like you?" The jokes weren't funny, but they were loud enough to gather attention. People inside the diner peeked through the windows, watching the scene unfold. Shaq's face remained calm. He had learned long ago not to let words get under his skin. Being famous had taught him patience. People always had something to say, and most of the time it came from those who didn't really know him. He kept his eyes steady on the door, but inside, he was already preparing himself for what might come next. He didn't want trouble, not in this quiet town, but he could tell the bikers weren't about to make it easy for him. His stomach growled again, reminding him that all he wanted was a simple burger, not a show. One of the bikers stepped forward, a smaller man compared to Shaq but with a sharp attitude. He looked Shaq up and down and chuckled. "You lost or something? This ain't the place for you," he said, half teasing and half challenging. The group laughed again, encouraging him. Shaq took a slow breath, looked down at the man, and simply replied, "Just here for some food." His voice was deep, calm, and steady, the kind of voice that made people listen even when he wasn't trying to sound threatening. For a moment, the biker paused, realizing that this was no ordinary traveler. The tension in the air grew thicker. More people had gathered on the sidewalk, sensing something was about to happen. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record. They didn't want to miss what seemed like the beginning of a confrontation. Shaq noticed but didn't react. He had been in the spotlight his entire life, cameras didn't bother him anymore. He was more focused on the group in front of him. He knew the best way out was to remain calm, but calm didn't always work on people who thrived on attention. The leader of the bikers, the man with the beard and sunglasses, finally pushed off from his motorcycle and stepped closer. He wasn't afraid, or at least he wanted to show that he wasn't. He smirked and said, "Big guy, you sure you're tough enough to walk through here? Maybe you should prove yourself first." His tone was mocking, but his eyes were sharp. Shaq simply looked at him, not blinking, not smiling, just standing there like a wall. The crowd around them grew silent, waiting to see what would happen. In that silence, Shaq's past seemed to echo in his mind. He remembered the arenas filled with fans, the roar of the crowd when he had stepped into a WWE ring, even if only for special matches. He remembered locking eyes with opponents much larger than these bikers, men who trained their entire lives to fight and entertain. He had stood tall against them, not because he wanted to prove his strength, but because he had nothing to fear. That experience gave him confidence even now. These bikers didn't know that side of him. To them, he was just a tall stranger. To those who recognized him, however, he was something much more. The wind blew across the parking lot, carrying with it the smell of fried food from the diner. Shaq smiled faintly, not at the bikers, but at the thought of the meal he was about to enjoy. He shifted his weight slightly, placing one large hand in his pocket, showing he wasn't bothered. The bikers exchanged confused glances. They weren't used to people ignoring their games. Normally, their presence was enough to make others nervous, but this man stood there as if he was carved from stone. That silence spoke louder than any comeback could. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that the situation was about to turn in an unexpected direction. What the bikers didn't realize was that the giant standing before them had already faced challenges much bigger than this moment. He didn't need to fight to prove his worth. All he needed was patience, and soon enough, the truth about who he was would come out. For now, he waited, calm and steady, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. The afternoon sun sat heavy in the sky, washing the diner's parking lot in a warm golden glow. The smell of grilled onions and sizzling patties drifted out from the kitchen, teasing everyone's hunger. Inside, customers sat frozen, watching the large man outside who seemed trapped in a silent standoff with the rowdy bikers. Children pressed their noses against the glass, whispering questions to their parents. Nobody was eating anymore, all eyes were on the scene outside. Shaq stood tall, his shoulders relaxed but his presence unshaken. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't backing down either. Years of discipline had taught him that the loudest person in the room wasn't always the strongest. Sometimes it was the quiet one who held the real power. The bikers couldn't understand that silence. They thrived on noise, laughter, and bold words that made them feel bigger. Now, faced with someone who didn't flinch, they felt the need to push further. The leader in sunglasses stepped closer again. His boots scraped against the pavement, and his heavy jacket swayed as he moved. He folded his arms, tilting his head like a man studying a challenge. "You think you're just gonna walk past us?" he asked, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "You don't look like you belong here. Maybe you should keep driving." His tone was not just mocking anymore, it carried the edge of command, the kind of voice used to control the group behind him. The others laughed in support, their voices bouncing across the parking lot. Shaq didn't answer right away. He let the words linger in the air. People leaned forward, expecting him to respond with something sharp or angry, but instead, he simply looked at the man, then at the diner door, then back again. He finally said, "I'm here for food, nothing more." His voice rolled deep, steady, and calm, like the low rumble of distant thunder. That calmness unsettled the bikers more than any loud reply could have. Another biker, younger and more restless, decided to add his own spark. He stepped forward quickly, pointing his finger toward Shaq's chest. "Big guy, don't you hear the boss? We said this ain't your spot." He jabbed his finger forward as if daring Shaq to react. Shaq's eyes followed the small movement, but his body stayed still. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't step back. He simply stood, breathing evenly, like a mountain rooted into the ground. The crowd around them whispered louder. Some of the older folks shook their heads, muttering that the bikers were asking for trouble. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, that's Shaquille O'Neal, isn't it?" The father hushed him quickly, worried that saying it too loud might change the mood of the group. But the recognition was spreading. More and more people were realizing who was standing outside the diner. Their phones were recording, their fingers typing quickly as they sent messages to friends about what was happening. The bikers, however, didn't notice. They were too focused on the large man in front of them. The leader smirked again, circling slightly as if trying to size Shaq up from a different angle. "You must think you're tough," he said. "But size doesn't mean everything. Around here, respect has to be earned." He tapped his boot on the ground as if to punctuate the words. His group nodded, puffing up their chests like loyal soldiers backing their captain. Shaq's lips curved slightly in the smallest of smiles. It wasn't a smile of humor, but one of quiet confidence. He knew what they didn't. He had already earned respect in arenas packed with tens of thousands of fans. He had played under the brightest lights, faced the strongest athletes, and stepped into worlds that most of these bikers couldn't even imagine. But he didn't need to say that. He let his calm expression carry the truth. The younger biker grew impatient with Shaq's silence. He reached out again, this time pressing his finger into Shaq's chest more firmly. "I said, you don't belong here," he shouted. The crowd gasped. The sound of the man's voice echoed against the diner's walls, mixing with the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Shaq's eyes lowered to the finger on his chest, then slowly lifted back to the man's face. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't even brush the finger away. He simply held the man's gaze with such stillness that the younger biker took a step back without realizing it. That tiny retreat broke the rhythm of the group. The leader frowned, clearly irritated that one of his own had lost ground without a fight. He stepped forward again, closer now than before, standing just inches away from Shaq. The size difference was comical. Shaq towered over him, his shadow stretching across the ground like a shield. Yet the leader didn't move aside. He raised his chin and said, "You think you're better than us, don't you? Standing there like you're untouchable." Shaq finally spoke again, his words low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I don't think I'm better. I'm just not here to play games." The sentence was simple, but it landed heavily in the space between them. The leader blinked, surprised by the tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of voice used by men who had nothing left to prove. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had already stood in the face of real battles. The onlookers murmured louder now. A few even chuckled quietly, recognizing that the bikers were starting to lose their ground. The name Shaq floated in the crowd more frequently. Some whispered about his basketball legacy, while others talked about his surprising appearances in wrestling years ago. The buzz spread like fire through dry grass. The bikers noticed the change in the crowd, but they still hadn't put the pieces together. To them, it was just noise. The younger biker tried again, this time with a louder challenge. "Why don't you show us how tough you really are?" he said, raising his fists slightly as if ready for a fight. The crowd gasped again, but Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't move into a fighting stance, nor did he look afraid. Instead, he tilted his head, studying the man with calm eyes, almost like a teacher watching an impatient student. "You don't want that," Shaq said quietly. His words weren't a threat. They were a fact. The leader felt the shift too. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He could sense that something was off. Most people would have reacted by now, either with anger or by backing away. But this man in front of him wasn't doing either. He was just standing there, solid and unshaken, as if he had done this 100 times before. The leader's instincts told him he was missing something important. The silence stretched again, broken only by the sound of a passing truck on the highway. Shaq took a slow step forward, not aggressive, but enough to make the bikers shift uncomfortably. The ground seemed to tilt with his movement, his frame casting an even larger shadow over them. The crowd held its breath. The tension had grown so thick that even the smell of food from the diner was forgotten. At that moment, the bikers didn't know it, but their challenge was beginning to unravel. They thought they were intimidating a stranger. What they didn't realize was that they were poking at a man who had stood inside a wrestling ring in front of millions, a man who had learned how to face giants without fear. They were testing someone who didn't need to prove his strength with fists. His calmness, his silence, and his steady eyes were already showing them more power than they expected. And while the crowd sensed it, the bikers were only just beginning to see that they might have picked the wrong man to confront. The moment felt heavy in the parking lot, as if time itself had slowed down. The sound of the diner's neon sign buzzing faintly above the door could be heard in the silence. The bikers stared at Shaq, trying to figure out why their usual intimidation tricks weren't working. For years, they had ruled this small town with their loud engines and loud voices, never facing anyone who could stand against them. But here was this giant of a man, standing still, calm as a rock in the middle of a storm. The crowd around them grew larger by the minute. Cars slowed down on the road just to see what was happening. People walking by stopped, curious about the scene. The energy had shifted. It wasn't just a casual disagreement anymore, it felt like something bigger. Some people in the crowd began whispering louder now, saying his name clearly. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," one man said, almost in disbelief. "No way," another replied, "what would he be doing here?" But then someone else nodded, confirming, "It's him. Look at the size of him. That's Shaq." The bikers noticed the whispers but didn't understand what it meant. To them, Shaq was just a giant stranger. They didn't watch much basketball, and his other achievements weren't something they had followed. The murmurs confused them, but they ignored it, focusing on proving their point. The leader of the group adjusted his sunglasses, looking Shaq directly in the eyes. "You got people whispering about you," he said with a smirk. "They think you're someone special. But to us, you're just another man standing in the wrong place." His words were sharp, but his tone had lost a little of its confidence. Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around at the crowd. He saw the children pressing their faces against the diner windows, the older couple holding hands while watching nervously, and the young men recording every moment on their phones. He knew what was happening. The truth about who he was spreading. Sooner or later, the bikers would hear it too. The younger biker, the same one who had poked him earlier, stepped forward again. He seemed eager to prove himself, maybe to impress his group, maybe to hide his own fear. "If you're so calm, why don't you show us what you've got?" he challenged, raising his fists slightly as if inviting a fight. The crowd gasped again, but Shaq stayed motionless. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just looked down at the biker with a steady gaze. Then, in his deep, steady voice, he said, "I've already shown what I've got, long before today." The younger biker frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. Before Shaq could even answer, a man from the crowd shouted, "He used to wrestle. That's Shaq from the NBA, and he's been in WWE too." The words cut through the air like a blade. The crowd erupted with chatter. People began to tell stories they had seen online or on TV, about Shaq's massive presence in basketball and his surprising appearances in wrestling events. "He was in the ring with the biggest names," one person called out. "This guy isn't just tall, he knows how to handle himself." The bikers froze for a moment. Their smirks faded. They glanced at each other, uncertain now. The leader's sunglasses slipped slightly down his nose as he studied Shaq more carefully. The realization was sinking in slowly. This wasn't just a random traveler. This wasn't just a man passing through their town. This was someone with a history, someone who had stood in the spotlight against real giants, not just local tough guys. The younger biker shook his head, trying to dismiss it. So what if he played basketball, he said loudly, trying to win back control of the moment. That doesn't mean anything here. But the doubt in his voice betrayed him. The crowd, however, wasn't buying it. They were energized now, talking louder, reminding each other of Shaq's highlights. Some even pulled up old clips on their phones to show proof. "Look," one teenager said to his friend, "here's him in the ring." They watched as Shaq faced professional wrestlers, holding his own with surprising agility for a man of his size. The bikers saw it too, and their confidence wavered further. Shaq finally took a step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. His shadow loomed larger, and the bikers shifted back slightly without meaning to. He looked at the leader and said, "I don't need to fight you to prove anything. I've done that already, in places bigger than this lot." His words were calm, but they carried the strength of truth. The crowd nodded, cheering softly, encouraging him without shouting. It was clear that they were on his side now. The leader tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. "Wrestling's just entertainment," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "That's not real." But his voice didn't carry the same sharpness as before. Deep down, he knew that anyone who could step into a ring, whether scripted or not, had to be tough enough to face enormous pressure. And here was Shaq, standing calm and steady, not even breaking a sweat. The younger biker, still restless, muttered, "He ain't gonna scare me with stories." But his body told a different story. His shoulders were tense, his steps unsure. He looked smaller now, like a balloon losing its air. The crowd noticed too, and some of them chuckled softly. The balance of power was shifting, and the bikers were on the wrong side of it. Shaq's smile returned, small but visible. He raised his hand slightly, not in a threatening way, but as if to signal that he was done with the conversation. "I just came here to eat," he said. "If you want to stand in the way, that's your choice. But you should know who you're standing against." His words weren't loud, but they carried across the lot like a message carved in stone. The crowd erupted again, cheering louder now. Some even clapped. The bikers stood frozen, caught between their pride and the growing knowledge that they had picked the wrong man to confront. The whispers of his past were no longer whispers, they were shouts from the crowd, echoes of his legacy that the bikers couldn't ignore. For the first time, the leader looked uncertain. He pushed his sunglasses up his nose, cleared his throat, and stepped back slightly. He hadn't admitted defeat yet, but his body language betrayed him. The crowd saw it, and so did Shaq. The tension was shifting, and the bikers were beginning to realize that this wasn't a fight they could win, not with fists, not with words, not with intimidation. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the diner's walls in orange light, it became clear that the truth of who Shaq really was had changed everything. The bikers were no longer in control of the moment. They were now standing face to face with a man whose past carried more weight than they could ever imagine. The air outside the diner felt thick, almost like a storm was waiting to break. The bikers, who usually laughed the loudest, had fallen quieter than anyone expected. Their leader still stood in front of Shaq, but the smirk he wore earlier had faded into something harder to read. Pride kept him rooted in place, but his confidence was no longer solid. The whispers from the crowd, the phones showing old clips of Shaq's wrestling days, and the way people cheered his calm strength had created a shift. The bikers were beginning to see they weren't just facing a tall man, they were facing someone who carried history with him. Shaq stood steady, his arms loose at his sides, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to raise his voice or flex his muscles. His silence was heavier than any punch. His presence alone seemed to speak louder than the noise of the motorcycles lined up behind the bikers. The crowd, sensing the turn of events, grew bolder. "That's Shaq," someone shouted loudly this time. "He wrestled in WWE. You don't want to mess with him." Others clapped, some even chanting his name softly at first, then louder as more voices joined. "Shaq! Shaq! Shaq!" The chant rolled through the lot, giving energy to the moment. The bikers shifted uncomfortably. They had started this standoff expecting to intimidate a stranger, but now the entire town seemed to stand behind him. The younger biker, the one who had poked Shaq earlier, looked around nervously. His earlier bravado melted under the weight of the crowd's energy. He stepped back slightly, his eyes darting toward his leader, waiting for direction. The leader clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated. He had built his reputation on control. He wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not used to being outshined in front of an audience. But Shaq wasn't playing his game. There were no insults, no raised fists, no anger, just calm power. And that was harder to fight than anything else. Shaq finally moved, taking a slow step forward. The sound of his shoe against the pavement echoed like a drumbeat. The bikers instinctively took half a step back, their bodies reacting before their pride could stop them. The leader held his ground, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. Shaq's shadow loomed over him, stretching across the ground, swallowing up the space between them. "You want to see tough?" Shaq said finally, his deep voice cutting through the air. He raised his arms slightly, not in a fighting stance but in a way that showed the sheer size of his frame. He turned slightly, letting the crowd see him fully. "I've been in arenas with people bigger and louder than you," he continued. "I've stood face to face with men who train their whole lives to fight. And I'm still standing." The crowd roared at his words, clapping and cheering. The bikers' faces hardened, but their confidence cracked further. They knew the truth now. This wasn't a man they could push around for fun. This was someone who had already been tested in ways they couldn't match. One of the bikers muttered, "He's just talking," but even his voice lacked conviction. Another shook his head and whispered, "Man, that's really him." The leader, still trying to hold on to control, sneered and said, "This ain't a ring, big guy. This is real life." His words hung in the air, but they sounded weaker than before. Shaq leaned down slightly, his eyes locking with the leader's. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why I don't waste my time on small fights. Real life is about respect." His words carried weight, and for a moment, even the leader couldn't find a comeback. The chant from the crowd grew louder again. People stomped their feet, clapped their hands, and shouted his name. The energy filled the air like electricity. The bikers, once feared, now looked like they were shrinking under the wave of voices. The younger biker, trying to save face, stepped forward one last time. He raised his fists higher, bouncing lightly on his feet as if to prove he still wanted a fight. "Come on then," he said shakily, "show us what you've got." The crowd booed him, shaking their heads, some even laughing at his stubbornness. Shaq didn't raise his fists. Instead, he straightened up, towering even taller. He planted his feet firmly, lifted his arms just enough to mimic the stance he once used in the ring, and looked down at the young biker with eyes that said more than words ever could. It wasn't anger in his expression, it was certainty. It was the look of someone who had nothing to fear. The crowd erupted again, cheering wildly at the sight. Some even shouted old wrestling chants, remembering the times Shaq had appeared in the ring. The young biker's confidence crumbled instantly. His fists dropped back to his sides. His face flushed red as he stepped backward quickly, shaking his head. "Forget it," he muttered, retreating toward his motorcycle. The leader saw it too. He knew the moment had slipped away. The crowd was no longer theirs, and neither was the control of the situation. He sighed, pulling off his sunglasses and rubbing his face. For the first time, his voice lost its sharp edge. "All right," he said quietly, almost to himself, then louder so everyone could hear, "we don't want trouble." The bikers looked at him, surprised. They weren't used to their leader backing down. But the truth was clear: this wasn't a fight they could win, not with fists, not with words, and not with pride. Slowly, they began to step aside, moving away from the diner door. The crowd cheered louder, clapping and whistling, as if celebrating a victory. Shaq gave a small nod, not smug, not mocking, just respectful. He walked forward, his steps slow but steady, and finally reached the diner door. As he pushed it open, he paused for a moment, turning back to the bikers. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but firm. "Next time," he said, "remember, respect doesn't cost you anything. But disrespect can cost you everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The bikers didn't reply. They looked away, some staring at the ground, others pretending to check their bikes. The leader simply put his sunglasses back on, hiding his expression. Shaq walked inside the diner, and the crowd followed with their cheers and claps echoing behind him. Inside, people greeted him warmly. The staff rushed to offer him a seat, smiling and thanking him for handling the situation without violence. Children came up to him shyly, asking for pictures, while adults shook his hand with admiration. Outside, the bikers started their engines quietly, the loud roar of their motorcycles sounding almost weak compared to the cheers still echoing from the diner. One by one, they pulled out of the lot, their pride bruised but their lesson learned. Shaq sat down at a booth by the window, finally picking up a menu. He smiled at the waitress, who asked nervously if he was all right. "I'm fine," he said calmly. "I just came here for a burger." His deep laugh rolled softly, and soon others around him joined in. The storm outside had passed, and now it was just a man enjoying a simple meal after standing tall when it mattered most. The diner returned to life slowly, though the buzz of excitement still hung in the air. People spoke in hushed voices at first, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened outside. Then the whispers grew into cheerful chatter, and the atmosphere warmed again. Families laughed, children pointed at Shaq with wide eyes, and older folks shook their heads, telling each other they'd never forget this day. Shaq sat at a booth by the window, his large frame filling the space, but his mood was calm and light. He opened the menu, though he already knew what he wanted: a big burger, fries, and a cold drink. The waitress, still a little nervous from everything she had just witnessed, hurried over with a smile. "We'll get you whatever you want, on the house," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for keeping things peaceful." Shaq chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No need for that," he replied kindly. "I'll pay like everybody else." His humility surprised the waitress, and she nodded quickly, writing down his order. As she walked away, a boy of about 10 years old approached the table with his father. The boy held out a notepad shyly, his small hands trembling. Mr. Shaq, can I have your autograph?" he asked. Shaq's face broke into a warm smile. "Of course," he said, taking the pen carefully between his large fingers. He bent down slightly to sign his name on the paper, his handwriting big and bold. The boy's eyes lit up with joy, and his father placed a grateful hand on Shaq's shoulder. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "What you did out there, it meant a lot, especially to our kids. You showed them what real strength looks like." Shaq nodded, appreciating the words. To him, it wasn't about showing off, it was about setting an example. He had learned long ago that true respect wasn't about fists or shouting. It was about standing firm, staying calm, and choosing not to escalate when others wanted chaos. Meanwhile, outside, the bikers had already left, their engines fading into the distance. Yet the memory of the confrontation lingered. The crowd who had seen it began to share the story with excitement, each telling the events in their own way. Phones buzzed with messages and videos being sent to friends and family. "You won't believe who I just saw," people typed. Shaq stood up to a whole biker gang. The story was already spreading beyond the little town. Back inside, Shaq's food arrived. The plate looked almost comically small in front of him, but the smell of the fresh burger made him grin. He picked it up with ease, taking a large bite. The crowd in the diner watched him with admiration, but they gave him space too. They knew he wanted to enjoy his meal. Even so, the energy of the room had changed. It felt lighter, safer, almost celebratory. An older man sitting at the counter raised his coffee cup in Shaq's direction. "To respect," he said loudly, and others joined in, lifting their drinks. Shaq smiled and lifted his glass of soda slightly in return. The simple gesture filled the room with laughter and clapping. As he ate, Shaq thought about the bikers. He didn't hate them or even feel angry. He understood pride, and he knew that sometimes people acted out because they wanted to appear strong in front of others. But strength wasn't about embarrassing someone or blocking their way. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He hoped, deep down, that the bikers had learned that lesson. Halfway through his meal, another person approached the table, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. She worked at the diner as well, wearing an apron with flour on it. "You know," she said softly, "I've lived in this town all my life. Those bikers, they scare a lot of folks around here. But today, you showed them they can't control everyone. Thank you for that." Shaq listened quietly, nodding. "I'm glad nobody got hurt," he said. "Sometimes all it takes is a little reminder that we all deserve respect." The woman smiled, her eyes misty with gratitude, before returning to the counter. Shaq finished his burger slowly, savoring each bite, while the energy of the diner swirled around him like a warm embrace. When he was done, he stood to leave. Instantly, people rose from their seats, not to block him like the bikers had, but to shake his hand, thank him, or simply smile at him. Children gathered near the door, waving goodbye. Shaq bent down slightly to give a high five to one of the younger kids, who squealed with excitement. Stepping outside, Shaq was met with the fading orange glow of the sunset. The sky painted itself in streaks of gold and pink, as if the day wanted to end on a beautiful note. The parking lot, once filled with tension, now felt calm and open. His SUV sat waiting, a quiet reminder that he still had a long drive ahead. As he opened the door, he heard a voice call out. It was the same father who had brought his son for an autograph. "Hey, Shaq," he shouted with a smile. "You've got a whole town of fans now." Shaq laughed, raising his hand in a wave before climbing into his car. Driving away, he reflected on the day. He hadn't set out to make a scene, but sometimes life placed you in the middle of one. What mattered wasn't the noise, but how you handled it. The bikers had come with pride and loud engines, but they had left quieter, hopefully wiser. The crowd had witnessed something they wouldn't forget, a reminder that strength doesn't always come from fighting, but from patience, presence, and respect. Miles down the road, Shaq turned on the radio. A sports station was playing highlights of his old games, and the commentator's voice echoed memories of the past. Shaq smiled to himself, shaking his head. He wasn't just remembered for basketball or wrestling, he was remembered for moments like this, too. Moments where he showed people that even giants can be gentle, and that true power comes from knowing when to use it. In that small town, the story would live on. People would tell it at family dinners, in classrooms, and around coffee tables. "Remember the day Shaq walked into the diner," they would say. "Remember how the bikers tried to block him? And how he didn't even raise a hand, but still won." The story would grow, retold with pride by those who had been there, each version carrying the same message: respect is stronger than pride. And for Shaq, it was just another chapter in a life full of lessons. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. His journey had already shown the world who he was. All he wanted now was a good meal, a peaceful drive, and the chance to leave behind moments that reminded people of what really mattered. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the road stretched endlessly ahead, Shaq leaned back in his seat, content. The town behind him would remember this day, not as the day bikers ruled the diner, but as the day respect stood taller than intimidation. And that was more than enough for him.